Before the First World War, many of the most interesting movies were made in Europe. The film industries of Britain, France and Italy were particularly innovative. A representative of the Lumieres first demonstrated the cinematograph in Britain at the Regent Street Polytechnic on the 20th of February 1896. Inspired by this, pioneers Burt Akers and R.W. Paul began their own regular screenings at the Alhambra Music Hall. There, in June 1896, Paul projected a film of the Derby. The screening was attended by the Prince of Wales, who owned the winning horse. R.W. Paul was a significant British pioneer who made around 50 films a year and opened Britain's first film studios in 1899 in Muswell Hill in London. The same year, Paul invented the camera dolly, a wheeled platform on which the camera could be mounted and smoothly moved around. This freed the camera and created a greater intimacy between the audience and the actors on screen. One of the most innovative of the British pioneers was the Brighton-based portrait photographer George Albert Smith. With The Kiss in the Tunnel, Smith cut between a railway carriage and exterior shots from the front of the train as it enters and leaves the tunnel. Commonplace today, this was revolutionary at the time, as was his use of close-ups as a dramatic device to tell the story in The Sick Kitten. The producer Cecil Hepworth expanded on Edwin S. Porter's advances in storytelling with Rescued by Rover, which laid the groundwork for the comic chase. For a brief time around 1905, Britain led the world in cinema, though France and Italy were soon to take over. Most French films of the first decade of the 20th century betrayed the influence of Méliès and the theatre. The dominance of the Pathé Company continued. By 1911 they were the major force in production, distribution and exhibition worldwide. Charles Pathé's head of production was Ferdinand Zecker, who plagiarised Méliès and everyone else. The French comedy trick film inspired by Méliès in turn inspired American comedy producer Max Sennett. Pathé's biggest star was Max Linder, a dapper gentleman who was cinema's first international comedy star. Charlie Chaplin later acknowledged the debt he owed to Linder. Years later the Frenchman came to work in the US and they met up. Chaplin had it filmed as they impersonated each other. Sadly, Linder's career in Hollywood wasn't successful, and he eventually committed suicide with his wife. Linder's daughter assembled a compilation of his American features, Laugh with Max Linder, and one of his Pathé shorts, The Man in the Silken Hat. Pathé's only serious competitor in France was the Gaumont Company, who prospered because of the talents of Alice Guy Blaché, the first woman director, Victorine Jazet, creator of the crime serial, and the prolific Louis Feuillade. Feuillade was discovered by Alice Guy Blaché, who was Léon Gaumont's assistant. Part of Feuillade's importance in the history of film was his rejection of the theatricality of most French films. The feeling was that cinema should duplicate the theatre to increase its prestige. In 1908, the Société Film d'Art was founded to elevate the motion picture by staging prestigious plays for the screen. Unfortunately, the films that resulted remained exactly that, staged plays. The Film d'Art did bring some prestige to cinema, and through productions like the 50-minute Queen Elizabeth starring Sarah Bernhardt, longer films became a possibility, though it also revealed that the overexpressive acting methods of the stage were unsuited to the new medium. Feuillade is best known today for his crime serials, but during his 20-year career he made between 500 and 700 films of all genres. Though he hated the film d'art movement, he was influenced by it. Even though Fantomas was filmed in Paris locations, it used a static camera. What was different was its compositional depth. Full-ID's use of movement and space within the frame, which was later to be described as its mise-en-scène. Full-ID's serials are an artful combination of fantasy and realism, which give them almost a modern sensibility. Fantomas was not a true serial, but more a series of self-contained films. Its villain definitely foreshadows Caligari and Mabuza as a master of disguise and criminal mastermind. Le Vampire was a true serial with a continuous story, an extremely worthy rival to the Pearl White chapter plays which were emerging in the US. It was there that the serial was to become a staple part of Hollywood production until the mid-1950s. The First World War began to hit the profits of the French film industry, and Charles Pathé panicked. He ordered his filmmakers to adapt their subjects to the international market. This was disastrous, and the industry collapsed. In 1917, Henri Diamant-Berger, a journalist and director, had warned, "British production is insignificant. Great Britain is no more than a colony to the American film industry. If we don't take warning at this example, we shall undergo the same fate." In 1914, 90% of films shown around the world were French. By 1928, 85% were American. Following the success of Luigi Maggi's The Last Days of Pompeii in 1908, the producer Filippo Alberini embarked on a series of epics which were the longest films up to that time. The first feature film had been produced in Australia in 1906, but the Italian epics were to inspire Griffith and other American filmmakers to think big and leave behind the one and two reels that had dominated the American industry. Mario Casarini remade The Last Days of Pompeii in 9 reels in 1913, but this was immediately superseded by Enrico Guazzoni's Quo Vadis, which was a big international success. The best known and arguably most influential of the Italian epics was Giovanni Pisoni's Cabiria. This film included impressive tracking shots and sophisticated special effects. The Italian epics, though, betrayed their theatrical origins with verbose titles, though they had undeniably impressive set pieces. The template for the epic movie was established, but despite its grandeur, Cabiria failed to match the success of Quo Vadis, and with the war, the Italian film industry, like most in Europe, entered a lean period. In fact, it would be almost 30 years before Italy would be a major player in film history again. The only European countries to maintain a thriving film industry during the First World War were those of neutral Scandinavia. In fact, Sweden had a golden age thanks mainly to the directors Victor Sjostrom and Moritz Stiller. The story of Scandinavian silent cinema, though, begins in Denmark, where the company Nordisk was founded in 1906. There, Asta Nielsen, a vamp years before America's Stina Bara, became one of cinema's first big international stars. Audiences accustomed to the demure heroines of American silence were startled by the sexual intensity of her acting. Nielsen was particularly popular in Germany, and largely based on her success, Nordisk by 1913 was second only to Pathé in the World League of Film Companies. The war saw Nordisk reach its peak as it fulfilled the demands of German theatres while the country's native industry was in the doldrums. But when the war ended, the Danish film industry collapsed. In 1916, 124 Danish films were made. By 1928, there was only one. The lack of opportunities in the Danish industry led most of its homegrown talent to go abroad. Asta Nielsen went to Germany as early as 1912. Carl Theodor Dreyer went to Sweden, where he made The Parson's Widow, probably his first really distinctive film, with its use of close-up and abstract composition.
Stilen kom frem af sig selv, da vi jo arbejdede i gamle huse fra det 17. og 18. århundrede. Vi opnåede, at vi havde lofterne med i billederne. Det var ret ualmindeligt dengang. I dekorationer, der er bygget op i atelier, der er jo sjældent lofter. Og så var det der, når vi så ud igennem vinduerne, så vi landskabet udenfor. Så det gav et for den tid i hvert fald ualmindeligt.
Benjamin Christensen, another Dane, also went to Sweden, where he made his most famous film Witchcraft Through the Ages. Probably the greatest director of the Swedish silent cinema was Victor Sjostrom. In 1957, Ingmar Bergman cast Sjostrom as an elderly professor in his classic Wild Strawberries. Bergman entered the unconscious mind of the professor with nightmares and nostalgia of his youth, as the old man travels to receive an honorary degree. It was in a sense a tribute from one master of Swedish cinema to another. Svenska Bio, the main Swedish company, was set up by Charles Magnusson in 1909. Sjöstrom's style as a director was formed within a year of joining the company. Ingeborg Holm displays his mastery of poetic imagery, deep focus photography, and heightened perspectives achieved by placing objects at 90 degrees to the camera. He held shots much longer than was common at the time, letting audiences take in every detail in the surroundings and how the characters related to them.
Förkrossande intryck på mig. Jag var djupt skakad av då den filmen. Jag vet inte för att jag förstod den eller för någonting annat, utan helt enkelt tror jag det att den inverkade på mig med sin oerhörda kinematografiska kraft. Alltså det var en total känsloupplevelse för mig. Jag kommer fortfarande ihåg den. Jag kommer precis ihåg vissa sekvenser, vissa bilder som gjorde ett kolossalt intryck på mig.
Sjostrom was enticed to Hollywood, where he successfully directed Lon Chaney in He Who Gets Slapped, and probably most memorably Lillian Gish in The Scarlet Letter and The Wind. Although he made 9 films for MGM, Sjostrom eventually returned to Sweden and an acting career. The other great silent Swedish director was Moritz Stiller. His films were often as powerful emotionally as Sjostrom, but sometimes he sacrificed emotional depth for a rather detached technical ingenuity and epic scale. Stiller was also adept at comedy. His delightful comedy of manners, Eroticon, was very influential in romantic film comedy. He is most famous today for discovering Greta Garbo and starring her in the biggest film of the Swedish silent cinema, The Atonement of Gösta Berling. Garbo, like most of her talented contemporaries, wasn't to stay in Sweden for long. She went to Germany first, then to Hollywood. Ironically, Louis B. Mayer actually wanted to mentor Stiller more than Garbo, but the director's career in America was disastrous, and he returned to Sweden where he died in 1928. By then, the Swedish film industry's first golden age was over.